By way of introduction, it appears from your statement and your opening statement, in addition to public statements, that there are indeed three issues that the Commission should properly investigate. The first is to understand what happened in the period under review. And we have 3 years of evidence before the Commission, and we have certain statements in the opening and in your general statement in that regard. But the second is perhaps more important for present purposes, and that is to understand how these things could have happened. And it is in that regard that many of the questions will be put before you, Mr. President. In other words, what were the circumstances and events that allowed these things to happen, which appears by public consensus, as you say, to have been conceded to have happened? And the third element that is also very important, that may have to stand over to a large extent to the second session of your evidence, is how can these things be prevented from happening again? So we will cover all three issues, but concentrate principally on issues 2 and 3. Of course, we will also ask of questions of what you knew was happening in terms of or in relation to the terms of reference. And in relation to the third question, we will also ask what you as President, the ANC, and the executive which you are leading are doing or intend doing or think should be done to prevent it happening again. And many of those elements are already in progress. For example, matters in relation to law enforcement agencies, the Political Party Funding Act and others. But there are other questions that will arise out of that. And the object will be to ask on your part for evidence that will allow the Commission and the Chair in particular to understand what best are the remedies that can recommend. But having said that, by way of introduction, Mr. President, there is a unique element to this evidence. This is your Commission. This Commission is reporting to you, and in that sense, it is a unique situation. But notwithstanding, we hope that you will help us do our job for you properly.
Of course, it is a presidential commission in his capacity as president of the country, not as president of the ANC.
Yes, well, that's also true, Chair. So maybe I should reserve that question for the next session. Mr. President, what we have done in response to your statement is look at certain paragraphs in the statement and to deal with matters arising from those paragraphs, and in particular your statements in those paragraphs. But if we leave anything out in the sequence, please alert us to it so that we can then go back and everything can be taken in its proper sequence. So the first issue that we do have to raise is on page 12 of Bundle 1, Exhibit BBB1. But if there's anything before that, you no doubt will alert us to it. This is the introductory portion of your statement.
I'm sorry, Mr. Professor, you said page 12?
Page 12.
You explained to the President the black numbers and red numbers?
Yes. We will be dealing, there are 2 sets of numbers on each page. We will be dealing with the numbers at the top left hand. corner. And we've taken the liberty of using the acronym CR there.
My page 12, Mr. Pretoria, starts with "in the course of this commission's work." Is that the right page?
Yes.
Is that the right page?
Yes.
Okay.
In paragraph 21 on that page, Mr. President, you say, "In such circumstances, political parties do not merely represent their members, but often act as instruments to advance the needs and interests of entire sections of society. This is among the reasons that the ANC describes itself as a liberation movement, first and foremost, that, among things, contests elections as a registered political party." I understand from this paragraph, as well as parts of your opening statement, that the party sees itself, in terms of liberation, constitutional policies and principles, the development of the South African society in accordance with these principles, as a leader in society. There can be no doubt about that fact. And as I understand it, that would be the justification that the party holds for adopting the stance that it is entitled to and does seek to control the levers of power. Do you have any comment on that? Is that common cause?
With reference that you make to paragraph 21, indeed, the ANC characterizes itself as a liberation movement, which we really have been from formation, and largely because we were set up to achieve certain objectives. And those objectives remain current to be executed. And you could say, in part, some of them have been, like we now have a democratic dispensation, but we still want to pursue a truly non-racial South Africa. That has not yet been truly achieved. We're also a liberation movement because we seek also to attain a non-sexist South Africa. Sexism is still rife in our country, and it's also compounded by the continued violence that is perpetrated against women. But more importantly, also to attain a prosperous South Africa. That is an overarching objective. And that remains what the ANC has as its objectives, that characterizes it as a liberation movement. But in the midst of all this, it still has to be a political party that contests elections. And in doing so, it then is supported by millions and millions of South Africans. So when it acts, it needs to fulfill the mandate that it has set itself out to achieve, which is informed by the ordinary people who elect it. Because as we craft our manifestos, we don't do it just merely for ourselves. As a party, we go out and gather the views and the aspirations of ordinary people. And therefore, when we are then elected, we represent the people of South Africa. And it is for this reason that we say we hold power not just for ourselves. We hold power and execute power, exercise rather power, in the interests of the people of South Africa. There are many millions who elect us, and it is for this reason that we say, and it's been conceded, that we are a leader of society, and what the ANC does and says quite often determines the mood in the country, determines the direction that the country should go in. So it's a role that is given to the African National Congress by the majority of the people of this country. And they expect the ANC to act in a way where it will lead government and it will lead transformation and achieve the objectives as set out by itself as a liberation movement.
Thank you, Mr. President. It may seem what you've said should be taken for granted, but perhaps it shouldn't be taken for granted. There are two things that flow from that statement, particularly the latter part of your statement, that there is an expectation on the part of South Africans that the party will lead in dealing with policy, problems, solutions, and the like. And we'll come back to that point later. But the second is that the electorate would then be entitled to know how and what, how the ANC intends to go about its business and business of the country, the people, and what it is doing in that regard. That's a fair statement. Obviously, there are exceptions, but
I would concede that, yes, they are entitled. And in other ways, we also describe ourselves as the ANC, as the parliament of the people. And when the ANC was formed in 1912, we, the leaders of past, then characterized even that moment as the creation of the parliament of the people, because the people as a whole, the majority, were excluded from the parliament, the so-called parliament that existed then. So yes, people are entitled to know. And that is why the ANC, for the most part, has been one of the very few parties in the country that has been willing and prepared to open, as it were, its chest, its heart to the people of South Africa and admit its own mistakes, and also set out the ways it seeks to correct, much as sometimes, because it's a political movement, there will be contestation on some of the issues.
You may keep your mic on.
Okay,
Mr.
I will do so.
Yeah.
then, Mr. President, after certain introductory structural remarks concerning the ANC's structures and processes, you deal with cadre or cadre development and deployment, beginning at page 15. And in paragraph, well, perhaps I should presage that with a summary of the evidence, a very, very broad and perhaps superficial, but if it is superficial, you'll tell me, summary of the evidence in relation to cadre development and quote-unquote cadre deployment. On the one hand, there has been evidence that the policy goes far beyond mere recommendation and, in fact, is a policy implemented on the instruction and mandate of the deployment committee. That's one view, and there's certain evidence in regard to that. Whether that's exceptional or the rule, maybe we can deal with in due course when we come to detail. The other view, which is reflected in your statement and other statements, Mr. President, is that the deployment committee goes no further than make recommendations and abides by the formal selection processes that take place, for example, in the public service. Those are the two extreme views, and whether either is correct or not, Chair will have to consider and decide. Or it may be that neither is correct as a general rule, and that there is quite a large grey area between. What would your comment be?
The deployment committee, as I said in my statement in chief, should really be seen as a committee that recommends, a recommendation committee. And having been the chair of the deployment committee as deputy president, the process that really gets underway is as follows, and maybe I'm simplifying it. The minister concerned, for instance, that when it comes to, say, state-owned enterprises or state entities, would come forward and say, I need to appoint the CEO of one of the key state-owned enterprises. And in doing so, they will then have that post advertised, as they should in terms of the regulations and corporate governance and so forth. And a message will then be forwarded to, yes, the ANC Deployment Committee, that there is a position that the minister will come to the Deployment Committee with to articulate what position they need to fill. But then they will have triggered the process of the formal process of filling that position. So the advert then goes out so that whomsoever applies. But then internally in the ANC, people will then be encouraged to apply, that there is this position. If you qualify, you could be one of those who are either shortlisted or whatever. Then the minister will then say, we've shortlisted a number of people, and in the shortlisting, these are the people who have been shortlisted. Some of them may not even be ANC members. Some of them may well be ANC members. And what is then looked at by the deployment committee is to say, we really need someone with experience. For instance, if it's a railway entity of railways, and who has been well trained and well prepared and all that. And having done that, the deployment committee could well say, well, in our view, so-and-so fits the bill. It could be an ANC person, it could be a non-ANC person, completely unattached to the ANC, that we believe that this person can do the work. And then it goes off to the final selection process that the minister then gets involved in with her colleagues in cabinet, because an interviewing panel then is put up, and if it's, for instance, a director general, it happens in cabinet. If it's a state-owned enterprise, it happens in terms of company rules and what have you. So that then ensues. And then at times, Chairperson, the desires of the deployment committee are not even fulfilled. They may well have said, we want so-and-so, and it may not happen. And we say that should be in terms of the prescripts of the law, corporate governance, and the prescripts of the selection process in, for instance, in the public service. So, having chaired the deployment committee, I know that for a fact that in some cases the deployment committee wishes may not happen. So it is for that reason that I describe in the main the deployment committee as a recommendation committee. And it takes into account a whole number of considerations. You could ask, are some of them political? Yes, for key positions where we seek to advance the mandate of the governing party, yes. But where, for instance, the requirements and the experience of a candidate override that, we then say, we rely on this person as a South African to execute the task.
Whether it always happens that way or not, we can explore in due course with some of the more detailed evidence that we've been given. But I understand you to have said that the whole process does require some form of statutory or other regulation, and we can explore that issue as well in due course. But for the moment, in paragraph 25 on page 15, your statement reads, "The policy of the ANC is aimed at ensuring that the person most fit for purpose is appointed, whatever critical position has been identified." And the statement is quite a strong statement. In other words, the object of the policy is to ensure, not merely to suggest, that the person most fit for purpose is appointed to a particular position. You've also now recently said that the deployment committee goes out to seek candidates. How does one ensure that a person most fit for purpose is appointed if it's only a recommendation and another body makes the decision?
The process of selection of, let me put it, deployment of people has evolved, has been evolving, and has been a subject of discussion even in our past conference. And in recent time, the last conference, the issue of professionalizing the civil service, professionalizing state-owned enterprises, and getting people who are fit for purpose has become accepted and has become more current. And as it has evolved from a past that did not necessarily subscribe to that. So as everything evolves, as everything improves and gets better, this is now where we are. And to this effect, even the Minister of Public Service has now embraced this process, and it's now in the process of being fully implemented in government. So we now have a new era, a new dispensation that is going to see to it that we have people who are fit for purpose. So what the deployment committee will now need to be doing is to seriously ask itself whether people are fit for purpose, even as it will recommend certain people who could head any state-owned enterprise or head any department as DG. It has to use this as a filter and ask itself, is that person fit for purpose as it recommends? So I don't see the two things as mutually exclusive. I see this process as being seamless. Chairperson, we do so because we are serious about correcting what has gone wrong in the past. And this is an important plank that we are working on to make sure that we build this up as an important pillar of improving state capability. So when I will speak as head of the state, I will talk about how we are going about improving state capability, and this is one of the areas that I will address myself.
I'm sorry, Mr. President. What is the importance, Mr. President, of this deployment committee having the power to recommend as opposed to simply identifying potential candidates and encouraging them to apply like everybody and be considered, and if they are considered the most deserving, they get appointed? So what is the importance of the committee having to recommend as opposed to simply saying, we know there's this position available, we would like some of our members that we know are qualified and we think are suitable, or, as you say, people in society that the organization is aware of, that things should be encouraged, encourage them to say, you apply and you compete with everybody. So if you do it that way, the people that the deployment committee thinks are appropriate will be among those who will be considered. But they won't be coming with a recommendation from the deployment committee that the minister knows about. They'll be coming like everybody. But the deployment committee and the organization should be covered because it has made sure that people that it thinks should take those positions are there with others and competing fairly.
With respect, the chairperson, I hope you don't think that I'm being pedantic when I say maybe the two are not mutually exclusive.
Yes.
And I say so advisedly because as previous chair of the deployment committee, we did have some situations where the deployment committee will have identified 2 or 3 really suitable candidates and would say all of them, their names should go forward. And in the end, the final decision is then left to the final selection process in government. So what you are saying is that could the deployment committee not just identify instead of recommending? I would say the two are not mutually exclusive. It's been possible where all 2 or 3 names have been sent forward, and in other situations it's been a recommendation of 1 or so. So, and I take that, and it's not impossible for the deployment committee to function in that way, because all that it really seeks to do and should seek to do is to get whoever is fit for purpose, particularly now in this new, if you like, reformed era of making sure that we do have people who are really good and fit for purpose, who will be able to execute the task at hand without feeling that they need to pursue and advance certain side interests.
Well, that question arises in my mind because it would seem to me that where a minister is the authority, is the appointing authority, for example,
yes,
and he or she knows that among the candidates, there is this candidate who enjoys the recommendation of the deployment committee. And remember, the deployment committee is chaired by the deputy president of the party and the deputy president of the country, because that's how it works at the moment. It seems to me that it might put some pressure on the minister to take this candidate unless one of the other candidates really excels. So in other words, this candidate seems to come with an advantage that nobody else knows about other than the deployment committee and the minister. So the other candidates think we are all competing on an equal footing, but this one already enjoys a recommendation from the deployment committee. Of course, a recommendation that has been made by the deployment committee, not knowing the strengths and credentials of other possible candidates. And then the minister is aware. A committee chaired by the deputy president thinks this is the person who should, or recommends that this person should be appointed. Do you want to say something about that?
I do indeed.
Yes.
I do want to say something, Chairperson, and I will paint to you the practical experience that unfolds at the deployment committee. And it's good that you actually cite the situation of a minister who would come to the deployment committee. Quite often, ministers come to the deployment committee having gone through a process, a pre-selection process themselves, and their various either officials or committees embedded in their own ministry, where they sift through a number of, say, possible names. And when they come, they seek to convince the deployment committee about certain candidates who may be shortlisted. So in the end, quite often, it's not even at the instance of the deployment committee. It is at the instance of the minister, who knows and should know the skills, the experience that are fit for purpose for the task that they manage or they run in the ministry. So they would know, for instance, CEO of an entity, what the requirements are. And the deployment committee does not know in full. So they come to the deployment committee and seek to convince the deployment committee and even put up a pitted, not fight, but argumentation of why the persons that they may want to see appointed should be recommended by the deployment committee. So that is the practical experience that I've had. So the deployment committee, in the end, it will tell people that apply, there are these positions, but it is the deployee in that ministry or in that who manages that state-owned enterprise who would know in greater detail, in finer detail, precisely what is required. So they seek to convince the deployment committee. So if you like, the deployment committee therefore plays a recommendation role, but it also plays more of a reactive type of role. You could ask, is there any desirability for the deployment committee? And we would say, yes, there is, because it should serve as a filter. We're a political organization, and what we do in government is very political. So you do need that political filter, but it should also not be a political filter that will go ahead and appoint people who are not fit for purpose. It should be a filter that will make sure, and if you like, it should be a quality type of assurance that in the larger scheme of things, we are going to have people in senior positions who are going to execute the mandate as set out in the manifesto of the governing party.
Now, the two approaches you said, they are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
And I agree. I've already indicated what possible criticism can be directed at the approach as you have described it,
yeah.
Namely that the candidate recommended by the deployment committee has this added advantage. And I assume that it's not known to anybody other than the deployment committee and the appointing authority, the minister. I may be wrong on that. What criticism would you have with the other approach, which simply says your interest as an organization in making sure that that certain strategic positions are occupied by people who understand your policies and so on and so on, that would be taken care of if you encourage candidates, suitably qualified candidates, to apply. But once they have applied, why don't you leave it to the process and the appointing authority? And the appointing authority is your own cadre who is supposed to understand the policies of the ANC, and he or she will then look at all of these. But in that way, the candidate doesn't come with some extra added advantage. Would you have criticism for that approach and say it would not be suitable?
No, I wouldn't, except that what often happens, it is actually the minister
who comes to you,
who comes and say, I am recommending the following, and the deployment committee then examines that, and it is often convinced
about the ministers.
Oh yes. And I've been in situations where the minister would come back maybe 2 to 3 times, and say,
I want this one.
This is the best one, and I want to convince you and even bring further documentation to prove the case.
Yes.
And then I'm not suggesting that the minister browbeats the deployment committee into submission, but that's how it often happens. But having said that, your point is a good one, and I would say yes, because I don't really see the two being so mutually exclusive, particularly because of the role that the minister does play.
Yes, yes.
As the minister should, because they are the executive authority who has been deployed to do precisely that.
Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps it bears mention, Mr. President, that there are 3 issues that we will canvass in the time allowed. The first issue is, as you've elaborated in some detail, how is the system designed to work? How should it work? The second issue is how, whether in part or to a greater or lesser degree, that may be debatable, how it did work in the past. What problems arose? You've mentioned some problems, and we'll come to it in a moment, so that one can understand how best the third issue can be addressed, and that is the regulation that you yourself have proposed in your statement towards the end, and we'll get there. There's another distinction that is quite important to bear in mind, and that is there are various categories of quote-unquote deployment. The first is executive positions, for example, ministers, deputy ministers, and the like. The second is members of public service, DGs and employees employed in the public service at whatever level, and we'll come to that as well. And the third is state institutions, the Chapter 9 institutions, other appointments, whether at the hands of Parliament or the President or otherwise. So perhaps we should be aware of those distinctions when, well, I certainly will try and be aware of them when I'm putting questions to you about that. The deployment policy of the ANC is, I presume, a developing document. It's contained in your bundle at page 122.
Did you say 182, Mr. Pretorius?
Paragraph 122.
Paragraph 122.
No, page 122.
Page 122.
Got that.
Is this the deployment policy of the ANC?
Yes.
And does it have a date, or is it a developing document? Has it grown over time? I see if you look at page 138, there's a reference to 2018 in paragraph 67.
Yes. It's what I would call a living document. Living because as the ANC develops its own policies and polishes those policies up, so are these types of policies also being panel beated into better shape, if I can put it colloquially in that way.
That point we can deal with perhaps at the end in more detail, Mr. President, but if I could ask you please to go to page 105. This is a different document. This is the ANC Constitution.
Yes.
What page, Mr. President?
105.
105.
Thank you.
To paragraph or clause 25.17.20. This is the ANC Constitution. Take it, that's how it's identified in your statement.
Yes.
This is paragraph 25.17 appears on the face of it to be a list of acts of misconduct which would apply to members of the ANC for which disciplinary proceedings, or in respect of which disciplinary proceedings may be instituted. 25.17.20 says, in the case of a public representative breaching his or her contract of deployment concluded with the NEC, does that creature still exist? Contract of employment with the NEC? Or please tell us about it.
Yeah. This presupposes a public representative, an elected public representative. Public representatives are ostensibly supposed to have a contract with the NEC. When our Secretary General, and I think even during the tenure of the subsequent Secretary General, we presumed a situation where a public representative would literally accept their deployment as a public representative and sign a contract with the NEC, in the end, with the Secretary General, where they say, I accept my deployment, so that where it comes to a point where they have to be either removed, it's a termination of contract. Because in the past we faced a situation where some would say, I have been elected and I'm not stepping down or whatever. I'm not agreeing to being removed. So it deals more with publicly elected representatives and not so much with, say, appointees who would be governed by other provisions, which has to do with the appointment either in the civil service or in terms of company laws in the public enterprise.
Understood. Would the contract of employment have any substantive provisions setting out the duties of the public representative?
Yes, ostensibly it's supposed to have that. And I was also involved in the preparation and the drafting thereof in the past, and I have not really kept abreast with the continuity of such. And I would say that if it hasn't continued, it is a very good instrument to have, because it helps to regulate the relationship in the end between the organization and the person who is deployed. And this would also apply to a president, where the president has a contract with their organization, because even as president and minister or whoever, you are in the end deployed by the organization, because we have that type of political system.
Would it be fair to say, or would you accept that the electorate which elects the person to public office would be entitled to know by what contractual provisions their representative is bound?
Absolutely, I would say yes. Just as right now we've even published, as you might well know, at government level, and we can deal with that when I come as President of the Republic, published the contracts I've entered into with the minister. Performance contract.
Well, in passing, I must just say, Mr. President, that the Commission has struggled a lot to get previous performance contracts of ministers. To the best of my recollection, we got documents which reflected how they were supposed to look like. And I'm not sure that we ever got the ones that were actually signed, but maybe some unit of the Commission has, because we wanted them at a certain stage, starting from 2010 or 2009. And the information I was given at some stage looks like nobody knows where those contracts are. But maybe they have been found, I'm not sure. But it would be good if the ones that have been signed are kept properly with the public, or a commission like this wants them, they can get them.
Chairperson, I undertake when I come before you again, I undertake to bring a box full of them.
I also hope, Mr. President, in the box will be included performance assessments of ministers during that time.
We are in the course of doing performance assessments now.
Now, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
So you may find a very incomplete process.
Okay, including presidents.
Including presidents, yes.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask the chairperson to assess.
Okay, Mr. Pretorius.
May I ask you to go back to the deployment policy at page 124?
Yes.
Paragraph 9 of the deployment policy says, our immediate goal as set out in strategy and tactics is to deepen the hold of the liberation movement over the levers of state and begin to impact positively on other centers of authority and responsibility outside the immediate realm of state institutions. Can you assist? What are those other centers of authority and responsibility?
This, put simply, is a political speak about the ANC exercising its leadership role in society. That the more we perform well in the state, that will have a cascading impact on a whole number of other institutions, be it whatever is your sporting bodies and all that, and we will all start working in a harmonious way. And with the ANC infusing this very positive developmental approach to how we should develop the country going forward. So that is what is envisaged here. It's more political speech.
It does talk about positive impact.
Precisely.
Rather than direct control.
Yeah, positive impact, which is the leadership of society.
Right. And then in paragraph 10, the policy reads, the following are the key centers of authority and responsibility within the state and should be given priority. 10.1, Cabinet. 10.2, the entire civil service, but most importantly from director level upwards. And 10.3, premiers and provincial administrations. And then over the page it goes on to legislatures, local government, parastatals, education institutions, independent statutory commissions, agencies, boards and institutes, ambassadorial appointments and international organizations and institutions. That list from 10.1 to 10.10, does that entire list fall within the scope of activity for the deployment committee, or is that list, should it be interpreted differently?
Well, for the most part, yes, it does. But I say for the most part advisedly, because in some instances, the deployment committee never really gets involved or concerns itself with this. If you like, the deployment committee has set itself its own limit, that we will only limit ourselves in terms of how we function or recommend people to these key positions. For instance, the Deployment Committee does not get involved in the appointment of ministers to cabinet. That is left to the president. But the president does consult his immediate colleagues, which are the officials of the ANC. But in the end, in terms of the governance system we have, it is the decision of the president and the president alone. So the Deployment Committee does not get involved in that. When it comes to the entire civil service, that has to be read to mean the top leadership of the civil service. Because it could never, it's not possible for the Deployment Committee to involve itself in the appointment of secretaries or directors and so forth. But it does, however, get involved in the appointment of directors general, and to some limited extent to also deputy directors general. But for the most part, the civil service appointments are done within the civil service itself, and in the end, even the minister does not also get involved in the appointment of the directors. It is the director general who gets involved in that. Of course, with premiers, yes, it is the Deployment Committee. Provincial administrations, hardly ever. The positions of DG of the provincial administration is done at the provincial level. The legislatures, there is a process of, if you like, deploying people to our legislatures as well, the national parliament and provincial and local, which really does not even, the Deployment Committee does not really get involved with that, because that's more of a very rigorous and robust democratic process that is involved there. Local government, and I explained somewhere in my affidavit, something quite innovative has now been done as this has evolved in the ANC, where it is no longer only the branches, the branch committees, it's also the community that gets involved in the final selection of people who should go into local government. Parastatals, yes, the key top positions. Education institutions, hardly ever. The Employment Committee, like with Cabinet, hardly ever gets involved. Independent institutions, only to the extent of your top key ones. And for instance, you'll be interested to know that when it comes to the judiciary, it is left to that process that we have in the law. Ambassadorial appointments, those will be recommended, and they are always often recommended by the minister. The minister, and in the end, because ambassadorial appointments are at the instance of the president. It is the president who appoints ambassadors because, in terms of our system, they represent the president in wherever they are deployed. So that too is a process that is engaged in, and the president, in those cases, takes the final decision. But he will also have discussed it with some of the colleagues. So international organizations is even a much more complicated one, because we don't appoint people to international commissions, organizations. All we can do is to recommend. And after that, it's left to the gods, as it were.
Yes, there has been some controversy on the latter point in relation to the BRICS Bank, but we didn't go there at present. I note that the judiciary is not mentioned in paragraph 10 as one of the institutions falling within the scope of the policy. But in relation to that scope, I understand you to be saying that that scope doesn't, although very broad, and although would, in terms of its policy statement permit the deployment committee to intervene in those areas. As a matter of practice, this is not done. Is that correct? For example, the entire civil service is mentioned here.
It is not done. It is just the very top key positions, as I have said, yes.
Or perhaps a closer integration between policy and practice may be looked at.
Absolutely.
If I could take you to another paragraph on page 133, para 47. This refers to strategic centres of deployment, and paragraph 47 reads, deployment within each of the 5 pillars requires its own set of strategic discussions. For example, within the state sector, what principles should inform the deployment of cadres to institutions with judicial or investigative functions, and how should cadres deployed to perform such functions relate to the organization? There's a second point made later on, but we can come back to that. That seems to indicate that there is at least a discussion taking place in terms of the policy about judicial and investigative functions, persons deployed to those functions, and how they should relate to the organization. Firstly, are persons deployed, at least in the sense of being identified and encouraged to stand for appointment in the judiciary?
In the judiciary, no, hardly ever. Hardly ever, and I think much as it might have been thought of, it has never really resulted in that. Because the appointment of people in judiciary in our country is so well managed through the dispensation we have, through the Judicial Services Commission, which manages all these matters so well. And in the end, my full understanding is that whenever there's a vacancy, there's a lot of activity amongst the legal organizations and fraternity who encourage one another that, why don't you apply, why don't you apply, why don't you seek to be Chief Justice or whatever. So that's what I believe happens. So that one has, if any, has actually been very much light touch and not at all in as far as I know.
Would those members of the Judicial Service Commission who may be members of Parliament, ANC members of Parliament, not be expected to talk to the ANC to say, here are candidates for various positions that will be interviewed in due course? Does the ANC have preference in terms of candidates? Do you know whether anything like that does happen?
Not as far as I'm aware.
Okay.
We've always relied on just what I've set out, yes.
Okay. Mr. Pretorius?
Again, there appears to be, at least on the face of it, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, a disconnect between what the policy reads and the practice. You concede that?
Yes.
The JSC, the Judicial Services Committee, positions on the JSC, are they subject to the activities of the deployment committee?
No.
No. Then a second point is made, which doesn't necessarily relate to the first point. It says, within the, quote, economy, unquote, the potential for cadres to accumulate capital in their personal capacities is manifest. Should such capital accumulated by deployed cadres be regarded as under the command and control of the movement, and if so, how? that's something that should be scrapped. Or what do you say about that?
No, I think this is impractical, wholly impractical. And to the extent that this may have been inserted here, it could have meant that those who may well have been put in certain positions in the economy are meant to manage those centers very well.